Blessings and greetings from Hickory Valley Christian Church. You have reached the message portion of our service today. We are in week 53 of pre-recorded messages. If you weren't aware of what happens behind the scenes, typically we film the welcome and we film communion on Wednesdays. On Thursdays, we do the message and the invitation. And then we send it out to Orrin, and Orrin compiles it and he puts it all together and he gives us this beautiful, pretty package that we've been able to engage with the last 52 weeks. We are excited to announce that Orrin got a full-time job, so Kenny Palmer is stepping into that position. So as you look around and things may look a little bit different, give a shout out to Kenny for stepping up and doing such a great job. But it's hard to believe that we only have 3 more weeks of pre-recorded services. On Easter morning, we are going to gather back in the sanctuary as one church. Now, I want to pause here for a moment. Even though a lot of our folks are still not going to be joining us on site in this sanctuary, I hope that you hear my heart on this. It doesn't matter if you are in this room. This room is not more spiritual than your living room. In fact, sometimes I believe your living room may be more spiritual. But however you engage with us, we want to invite you to continue doing so when we switch over to live streaming. Today we're going to be in a series, week 2, called Questions from Jesus. And one of the things that I love about Jesus is he asks tough questions that don't usually get an immediate response. Today is going to be a little bit different. We find when Jesus asks the disciples this question that they start giving quick responses. And when we arrive at Peter, he is so decisive and assertive and so bold in the words that he uses. So I'm excited to kind of examine that, to break it down, and to talk about what it looks like for other believers that are confronted with that same question: who do you believe that Jesus is? But before we get to that, I want to tell you a couple stories. But before I went into ministry, I feel like I held almost every single job on the planet. I've been working since I was 10 years old. I think I've only had one week or 2 weeks off since that moment. I've worked a lot of odd jobs. I worked at my dad's mechanic shop. I've worked at my mom's preschool in the summers at times. And then I went into food service. And my first gig was Kindred Bookstore. And I worked in their coffee store, or their coffee shop. And I had a lot of fun there. And the reason I had fun, to be honest with you, is because we never had business and we all just kind of hung out. When I went to Bible college, I started working in Knoxville, and I started working at restaurants. And I remember, man, my managers in these restaurants were incredibly difficult. They loved to show you who was in control. And there would be these moments at Calhoun's or Ruby Tuesdays or these different places that I worked that anytime they had the opportunity to display their power and to show you who they were, that they would jump to that opportunity immediately. And it happened quite frequently because one thing I noticed in the restaurant industry is that people love to complain. You know, I'm just doing my job. Just because I forget a few orders or I give you everything that you're allergic to doesn't mean that I'm necessarily in the wrong. But I remember that I got tired of working in those restaurants, and I moved over to this place on the University of Tennessee Strip called the Hibachi Factory. And it's this little hole-in-the-wall joint. It's really, really small, but it was also very successful. And one thing that stuck out to me very early on is that, man, the manager there is completely different than anyone that I've ever had before. I remember that when I first interviewed with Dennis, I was just struck with just how wild of a person he was. He had this long, flowing white hair that just kind of went all directions. He wore the same purple shirt that all of the employees wore. And he was always just this laid-back, supportive guy. But the thing that stood out to me the most about Dennis was not the way that he appeared. It wasn't his work ethic, which was really good. It was how much he loved his employees. He would, at any point he could, he would stand up and be a voice for those that were under him. I remember one day, Dennis was at the front desk. And just a reminder, Dennis doesn't look anything like an official manager. And I was in the back kind of waiting for some orders. It was right before the dinner rush really hit. And I remember this guy came in, and he was absolutely furious. He said, man, you just delivered this food, and it's absolute garbage. And he slammed it down on the front register counter. And he said, it took forever. It took 45 minutes for my food to be delivered. And when I got it, it's cold. I'm not eating this garbage. And Dennis said, I'm sorry, I don't know what we can do for you. And I remember the man, in the most assertive manner that he could muster, he looked Dennis in the eyes. He said, let me speak to a manager. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this guy has no idea who in the world he is talking to. And I remember Dennis said, yes, sir, let me go get the manager. And for 15 minutes, he went back to the staff bathroom and he cleaned up his hair. He put on a polo that he'd had, I believe, for opportunities exactly like this. It was this large amount of time. It got very awkward. The guy was just waiting at a table for the manager to come. And then out stepped Dennis. And he said, yes, sir, your manager is here. How can I help you? And the guy was just flabbergasted. He said, what is this? What are you doing? And he said, maybe, if you can get here this quick, that you shouldn't have ordered delivery. Stop complaining. Get out of my store. And I'm not saying this story to say that this is a good management style or this is how you should treat people. But this story is surrounded by the fact that most of the time that people came off of the streets and they encountered Dennis, they had no idea who he was, what authority he yielded. We've all had those moments in our lives, though, where we were talking to someone and we didn't know who they truly were. There's an actress by the name of Jenna Fisher, and she played this character on the show called The Office by the name of Pam. And that show has since gone off the air, and since it's gone off the air, it's got this huge following. And she said it's almost a daily basis that she'll go out onto the streets and people will say, man, you know what? You look just like Pam from The Office, but a whole lot older. And she talks about that, how no one has any idea who she actually is. Church, if you have any stories of encountering someone and you didn't know who they actually were, share your story below. We would love to engage with that. But like we said earlier, we're in week 2 in our series called Questions from Jesus. In our story today, Jesus looks at his disciples who have been following him around, who have been watching all of these events and all of these things unfold. He looks them dead in their eyes and he says, who do you say that I am? And I can't reiterate this enough. These 12 men had been following in the footsteps of their rabbi for thousands of miles at this point. They would have been covered in his dust. They've seen him feed thousands, heal the walking dead. They've seen him decimate religious leaders that had so much authority and so much power before. You see, these guys witnessed all of this with their own eyes. They were able to see the glory of God in front of them. And I'm sure there was these moments that when Jesus did his thing, his divinity stuff, when he shocked and he awed those that he encountered, that the disciples were standing behind him and they were asking this question, who in the world is this person that we're following? When you look at the scriptures, you begin to understand that, man, Jesus didn't, when he approached his disciples, he didn't say, hey, it's God here, begin following me. But he wanted them to wrestle internally with who it was that they were following. And we start to believe as you examine the scriptures that when they were following Jesus, that they never really connected the dots for a while. I want to make sure that you understand the full weight of what these boys witnessed. We're going to begin in Matthew 15 verse 29. Jesus went on from there, and he walked beside the Sea of Galilee, and he went up on the mountain, and he sat down there. And great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others. And they put them at his feet, and he healed them. So that the crowd wondered when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled healthy, the lame walking, and the blind seeing. They glorified the God of Israel. That passage we just read is the precursor to the question that Jesus is about to ask. And it paints this picture of this incredibly large crowd. And they are bringing absolutely everyone that is sick and suffering, and they are placing them at the feet of Jesus. One of the things that I want you to catch when you hear this story, you begin to feel a little bit detached. You start to hear of the lame, the crippled, the mute, all of these different diseases, but we don't put names to faces. For the followers of Jesus that walked behind them, these people that were being placed at the feet of Jesus were not strangers. They were not people that just had these diseases. This was the neighbors that the disciples grew up with. They knew the names of the people that Jesus was intimately healing and bringing hope to the hopeless. These teenagers, you see, they grew up with the hopeless. And right before their own eyes, Jesus divinely crafts hope as the Spirit of God, right in front of them, begins putting all of these broken pieces on their physical bodies back together. And it is in that exact same context that Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" Now, we've talked about this already, but I believe without a shadow of a doubt that there wasn't a moment, a footstep where their foot struck the ground where they weren't internally asking themselves that same question. Who is this Jesus that we are following? We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is not just a teacher, that he's not just another rabbi, that there's something more to this. It's a 2,000-year-old question that demands the same response to this day. You see, the world has many different opinions on who Jesus is, just like they did when Jesus walked the earth. In our culture, some people say, man, you know what? Jesus was a really good man. He was a revolutionary teacher. He taught culture and he shaped it to be more compassionate and more good. He looked at the poor and he loved them. Some in culture says he was a prophet. There's groups that still to this day hold him to be a prophet, someone who pointed to God but was not actually God in the flesh. But what you believe about who Jesus is will shape the way that you live and you walk today. So, church, who do you say that he is? To answer that, I think it begins to look like examining our own experience with Christ. Just as the disciples, they followed him for so long and they were covered in his dust and they were witnessing all of these powerful events that demanded for them to say, man, who is this in front of us? When we pull out our own lives and we begin to examine every single significant stage that has brought us to where we're at now, we have to ask that same question. What role has Jesus played in where I am right now? Is he just a good teacher? Is he a prophet? Or is there something more to this Jesus than other people are seeing? Let's examine the story together this morning. Please turn with me to the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to be in chapter 16, beginning in verse 13. This passage appears in the Gospel of Matthew as one of the most pivotal and climactic moments ever in Scripture. And I'm not just trying to build this up to be something more than it is. Matthew, the author, designed this to be the most pivotal moment in his gospel account. Now that you've seen Jesus, now that you've walked with him, what do you believe? Beginning in verse 13. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." I want to be clear here in this passage, in this first question that Jesus asked. This isn't the question that Jesus wants the answers to. He is setting up his disciples for questions that are they're going to call for deeper introspection, where they're going to have to examine their souls, their hearts, and their eyes with what they've seen from Jesus. Jesus, the good news here is it's not amnesia. He's not confused about who he is. He's not exhausted and says, man, just somebody tell me who I am and what I'm supposed to do. Jesus is asking a very pointed question at a very important part in his ministry. You see, at this point, Before he came to this Caesarea Philippi location, he had been followed by these huge, insane crowds where everyone was just bringing their sick and their hurting and laying him at the feet of Jesus. They were leaning in on every single word that he spoke. They wanted to be a part of this revolution that this young rabbi was doing in their community. But at this point in the story, Jesus has left the Jewish region, and he finds himself in a place called Caesarea Philippi. Now, if you know much about ancient history, your mind's starting to turn, and things are starting to connect already. But Caesarea Philippi is a Gentile region, and it's famous for the amount of idols and false gods that are worshipped there. You can go to Caesarea Philippi today, and one of the most striking things that you'll ever see in your life, there's this large hill, and at the very base of that large hill is this cave that looks like it shoots deep down into the ground. This complex surrounding the cave would have just been built up with all kinds of temples that pointed to different gods. But this cave in the ancient world, when Jesus was there, would have been flowing with water. And it was believed, and the story was told, that the god Pan, the god of nature, was birthed out of this cave and then started creating life and beauty and everything around him from that moment. So Jesus is asking this question to his disciples. He says, man, look at all of these other gods that exist. You see them behind me. You see them around me. According to the people that have been chasing after me, how do I measure up with all of these gods? Who do they say that I am? He's saying this. Who do they say I am against the competition? These religions and these worldviews that have so deeply shaped the culture of Caesarea Philippi, how do they stand up against this humble rabbi that didn't emerge from a deep cavern, whose image isn't carved into marble? And the disciples, I love this mental picture. They began to respond, and they're so straightforward. They say, man, the crowds believe that you are possibly John the Baptist or Elijah or Jeremiah. And I want to pause here for a moment and say, what do these names have in common? First off, they weren't just normal people. There was miraculous things that happened in their ministry. But the second part is so intriguing and so interesting. All of these men that are being mentioned by the disciples, they're all national reformers that have stood up against corrupt governments and been the voice for God. So what the disciples are saying to Jesus is, we believe that all of these people that have been crowding around you, they believe that you are about to start a revolution against Rome. Perhaps in seeing Jesus in these roles, people were hoping for a political Messiah who would overthrow these corrupt powers that have existed and oppressed Israel for so long. I want you to catch this. The crowds underestimated who Jesus was. They tried to shape him and turn him into who they wanted him to be, instead of looking deep down and saying, man, who really is this person in front of us? It's not a stretch to envision Jesus doing the same thing in our country today. I can imagine Jesus just coming forth, and behind him is all of these cultural forces that have completely shaped who we are as Americans. And I could imagine Jesus saying, man, how do I compare to the American dream? How do I compare to your favorite politician? How does Jesus compare to all of those cultural forces that have influenced who we've become? But the beauty of this is this first question is just a setup. What do they believe? What do the disciples believe? Let's pick up in verse 15. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter. On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So Jesus hits him with that first question, and he's talking about who do the crowds say that I am? And then Jesus laser focuses in on his disciples. He invites them to examine their experiences, examine what you've seen, examine the messages that you've heard. Who do you say that I am? Church, this is the most important question that Jesus ever asked. And I want to make sure that you understand this as well. Jesus is not just asking this question to those that followed in his footsteps. Jesus is demanding an answer to this question for anyone who has heard his name, who has heard his words and heard his teaching, anyone whose life trajectory has been impacted because of the name and power of Jesus. Who do you say that Jesus is? The reason this is the most important question is, let's hit it straight out of the bat. When you die, when your life is over, the way that you've answered that question on earth will determine how the Father will judge you. Secondly, who you believe Jesus is should shape every single facet of your life, from the way that you respond to your wife, for the time that you give to your kids, for your integrity and honor that you display at work, to the way that you spend your free time and your leisure. Do you live on mission, or do you live selfishly? The way you live answers that question. I love this. Peter knew the opinions of the crowd. He understood that they thought, man, he is a prophet, that this is a miracle worker possibly. But Peter knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that they hadn't seen the same Jesus that he had. And I love how the story reads. The gospel writer Matthew makes it out like Peter just blurts it out. Like Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And Peter almost couldn't hold it in anymore. He said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And I want to hit on that word living that is found at the end of that statement. When Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And he's surrounded by all of these dead gods and false idols. Peter says, you are the living God. You are not like all of this dead, decaying stuff that is all around us. He knew that Jesus was more than just a prophet. He knew that Jesus was more than just a good rabbi. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. He's saying this, Jesus, you are that sinless sacrifice that I have heard about from the time I was born and my parents started pouring the scriptures into me. From the time I committed my first sin and I felt grief deep down in my heart, you are the one that is going to be my perfect atonement. Your blood is the one that is going to wash over my sins so that I can be forgiven by the Father. He says, you are not just a rabbi and a prophet. You are God, and you are literally walking in flesh on the earth that you crafted with your own hands. You see, Peter, when he looked at Jesus, he was willing to give his deepest and his most heartfelt emotions because he understood that Jesus was real and Jesus was true. Peter's response to Jesus' question was not just the most climactic and pivotal moment in the ministry of Jesus. It is the most climactic and pivotal moment for every single follower of Christ. Because every single one of us demands an answer to that question. Who do you believe that Jesus is? Your answer to that question will determine your story for eternity. You see, Jesus, he doesn't just want to teach you something. He doesn't want to help you just become a better person. Jesus wants to save you from your sin. Church, let's worship this amazing God.
I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. No turning back, no turning back, no turning back. And I will follow you. No turning back, and I will live for you. No turning back, I will follow you, my Lord. No turning back, and I will live for you.
Church, who do you say that Jesus is? If you've been wrestling with this question for a long time, there's nothing more important in our lives than to point you to who this Jesus is. This God who died on the cross for my sin and yours. If you're carrying with you guilt this morning, you're saying, man, I believe that God is more than just a teacher. I believe that he is my Savior. I would love to talk to you about what that looks like. Church, as we come to a close this morning, live your life framed with that question. Who do you believe that Jesus is? If you believe that he is not just a prophet, if you believe that he is God, it should challenge and change the way that you interact with every single person in front of you. We want to invite you today, go be the hands and feet of Jesus. Tell of his stories. Point people to a living God. Church, we also want to give you an opportunity to give as an act of worship. You can do that in the link found below. Have a great week.